All right, well, let's go ahead and get started on the webinar today. This is Amy Peterson, and I'm here from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. Nick, can we go ahead and flip to the first slide? All right, so we are really excited this webinar. As Nick mentioned, as we were just starting out, this webinar is co-hosted by the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the Division for Research at the Council for Exceptional Children. And we're excited to work together on this webinar and the previous webinar we did recently with Drs. Kristen McMaster and Dr. Erica Lemke that focus on writing and data-based instruction in writing. And so this webinar today, we were going to focus on instructional practices and evidence-based practices in writing. So go ahead and flip to the next slide, Nick. Just to give a little bit of logistical information as we start, you'll see on your control panel that there's an opportunity to ask questions. So you will just go ahead and fill out any questions. If there are questions related to the content, we'll go ahead and hold those to the end and then address them with Steve, our presenter, at the end of the webinar. If there are technical questions or issues, we'll try and get to them as quickly as possible during and throughout the webinar as we go. You'll see also in your control panel that there is an opportunity for handouts to download the PowerPoint slide deck that we'll be using today. If you are struggling with that as well, I also included a link to where those are posted on the NCII website, so you can access those from the website if that's an easier method to download if you're having any problems with the handouts in the handout panel. So we'll go ahead and flip to the next slide. So I just wanted to start off by introducing our presenter, and then I'll turn it right over to him and we'll get right started into the content. So the webinar today is presented by Dr. Steve Graham, who is the Warner Professor in the Division for Leadership and Innovation in Teachers College at Arizona State University. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve to start us off on the webinar.
Hi. What I want to talk with you about today are effective practices for teaching writing, and I'd like to approach this in two ways. On the one hand, I'll talk about what's effective for all kids, and you can think of that as kind of Tier 1 instruction. But as we go through and talk about that, I'll also point out things that have been particularly effective at Tier 2 and Tier 3 as well. Everything that I'll share with you today has support from scientific research, and it's been demonstrated in multiple studies, so there's some reason to have some confidence in it. The disclaimer that I always give at the start of any kind of presentation is that you want to think of these as potentially effective in your classroom and with your students. Just because it worked in a research study doesn't mean it's the same situation in your classroom or with your students, but we do have some evidence that it has worked before and it has been effective in terms of improving. For the most part, what I'm going to talk about today are things that improve overall writing quality. Next slide, please. One way of kind of thinking about presenting evidence-based practices is not to think about them as kind of individual and discrete instructional elements, but to think more broadly about what they have to say about a full writing program. And I think there's 5 words that describe what evidence-based practices tell us about an effective and full writing program. First, students have to write. That's kind of the baseline level. Second, as they write, we need to look for effective ways of supporting them. Third, we need to think about what critical skills students need to acquire and we need to teach so that they're effective writers and can become skilled writers. Fourth, we need to connect writing as a tool for supporting learning and reading. And then finally, we need to create a classroom environment in which students can thrive. And so I'll talk about procedures that have a scientific basis for each of these as we move forward. Next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about writing, One of the things that I often do when I meet with administrators is I say to them, we need to double the amount of time students write. And I say that kind of jokingly because, quite honestly, we don't know how much students need to write. What I can tell you is that if we increase how much students write by 45 minutes a week of what they're currently writing, we see a 12 percentile point jump in the quality of what they write. And what I don't have here is we see about a 10 to 12% percentile jump in their reading comprehension on norm reference tests. Now that's the best kind of thing, is where you do something with your kids, and not only is there an improvement in their writing, but there's an improvement in the quality of their writing. Now the one disclaimer or kicker here in terms of writing is that all of this research has been done with kids that don't struggle with writing. So we're not as certain that writing in and of itself will increase how well students write if they experience difficulties with this complex skill. But I would, say that as a baseline, it's kind of like playing a sport. If you're not in there playing basketball, then what's the purpose of all the exercise? And it's the same thing with writing. The real skill here, the real kind of joy or love, is actually being involved in the process of writing. Next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about action steps for this, I think one good recommendation, and this comes out of the What Works Clearinghouse Guide for Writing, is that what that group recommended is that students spend 60 minutes a day either writing or receiving writing instruction. And again, I have to be really frank about this. I was the chair of that committee. This was a recommendation based upon expert opinion. But I think it's a fairly good one. If we don't provide writing instruction and we don't involve kids in writing, it's not very likely that they'll improve. Now, that doesn't mean that all the writing has to take place in a single classroom. It could be across classrooms, and it could include writing outside of school. And that goes to the second point on this slide here, is we want to make writing an integral part of content instruction. Students should write in social studies, science, math, and other content areas. And in the best of all possible worlds, teachers in those classrooms are also teaching writing as well, not just you. Next slide, please. Another thing that's very important in terms of increasing or having students write is we want to make sure that they understand the purposes for different kinds of writing. Now, of course, with Common Core State Standards today, we have 3 kinds of writing that are emphasized: narration, informative writing, and persuasive writing in its various forms. But it's not enough that students do those kinds of writing, but we want to make sure that they do those for real purposes and real audiences. That helps them understand why that particular kind of writing is important and what the purposes are. It's less likely that kids are going to acquire that if we simply just have them do this as kind of an exercise to improve their writing in those 3 areas or other areas as well. Next slide, please. A second aspect in terms of thinking about writing, and some of you will recognize what these particular points stand for, is that we would like for students to have extended opportunities for writing. So what do I mean by that? That means that we don't have all of our writing activities be something that can be completed in 15 or 20 minutes. But there are some activities that kids are engaged in, like writing reports, writing more extended stories, writing informational text for particular purposes that cut across multiple days, and in some instances, maybe multiple weeks. As I mentioned before, we want kids to write for real audiences. We want them to engage in cycles of planning, translating or transcribing, and evaluating and reviewing their compositions. So that compositions are more, or writing is more than just simply setting down and kind of throwing your ideas out on paper. It's planful, it's reflective, it's evaluative, and it is changeable. We also want to ensure that students take personal responsibility and ownership for their writing. So one way of doing this, for example, is like when you're giving feedback or you're conferencing with students, instead of saying you need to change this, it really relates to asking a question about, what were you trying to do here? Is this going to be clear to the person reading this, so that the student retains the ownership of the composition and they're involved in terms of making decisions about what revisions they make. And something that we'll talk about in a little bit is creating a supportive writing environment. But when you add all these things together, many of you will recognize this as the process approach to writing. Now, what you don't see there, and this is the case for how process approach is often put into play, is you don't see systematic and explicit instruction in terms of writing skills. What happens in the process approach to writing is that that instruction is delivered when it is needed, is the basic idea behind that. So when we look at this approach, we get about a 16 percentile jump. If you have a kid who's at the 50th percentile point, over about a year's time, we'd expect them to jump 16 percentile points versus kids who receive some other kind of writing instruction. So that's not bad. And this works for both kids with special needs and those without. Next slide, please. The second point that I made after write is that we need to look for ways of supporting writers. And I have to say, for the amount of time that one is going to spend, this is probably the easiest thing that you could do. When I teach a class at college level and I have a paper assigned, you can bet that I'm going to get some questions. And so one of the first questions that I'm asked almost always is how long, how many references, etc. Now, that's actually really smart on the part of the students in my class, because almost all writing assignments are relatively ill-defined. And so what my students are doing is they're trying to force me into a means-ends analysis by giving them more information about what my expectations for that written product are. And so when we tell students what we want, which really doesn't take that much time, we're more likely to get it. So in terms of writing quality, when we do this, we jump 28 percentile points, which is pretty incredible when you think about how much time this takes. This works with both kids who don't have writing difficulties and those that do. So let me give two concrete examples of this. So for many kids, when they revise their composition, what we typically see is what I call the thesaurus approach to revising. They clean up a word here or there. They try to correct a spelling error over here. They look to see if maybe they can move something a little, something small over here. They try to correct punctuation and capitalization. But there's not much in terms of substantive revisions. So think about kids with special needs. Often they don't write a lot of text. And when they revise, they use this thesaurus approach to revising. So a simple goal might be to revise your paper to include 3 new ideas. That introduces substantive revisions into the process. And kids are always successful, in my experience, doing this. Another example on the revision end is that we can ask them to make a modification, for example, in the story when they revise. So we can ask them to add a character. We can ask them to set it in a different time. This doesn't work always, though, as well as the first example I gave you. For example, in a study that we did, we had 2 kids who were asked to add another character, and those 2 basically said at the end of the paper, and by the way, there was another character named John, something of that nature. Another example of goals would be if we're working on persuasive writing, kids often don't consider the other side of the issue. So we may say to them up front, you need to have 3 reasons to support your proposition or what you believe, and you have to try to refute the positions on the other side. Next slide, please. So another way that we can support writers, both writers with and without disabilities, is involving them in working together to plan, draft, or revise their compositions. So this is around process, having kids work together around process. And this also has a very strong effect in terms of writing quality, 31 percentile point jump. Now, I want to be really frank about this. I'm not talking about you take two kids and you say, okay, you guys plan a composition together, or you two guys revise a composition together. In all the studies that were done, students were given a structure for how to plan and how to revise, and there was some practice given in terms of putting that schema into place in the classroom. But the nice thing about students working together, it can make writing more fun. It can also have the added advantage that peers learn from each other. The one caution that I would make here is you have to be really careful about this kind of who you assign to work with other students. Some kids, in my experience, are kind of natural teachers. They work really well with each other, and others want to take over the whole process. And if you have two kids working together, one that's a weaker writer and one that's a stronger writer who wants to take over the whole process, you may not get the positive results that we're talking about here for that more weaker writer. Next slide, please. Another way of supporting students as they write, in addition to setting goals, in addition to having kids work together, is a pretty straightforward kind of activity that teachers use quite often, and that is engage students in activities in advance of writing that help them organize and gain information. You know, one of the most obvious ones is reading information for something that you're writing that provides you with some of the gist or ideas for what you're going to say in your composition. But also things like graphic organizers that help you get your ideas out on paper in a simple form initially, and even in some instances help you organize those. So as an example, if students are writing a story, we might have a graphic organizer that asks them who the main characters are, when and where the story takes place, what the main character wants to do, what happens in the story, how does everybody feel, and how does it end. And what that does is it helps them generate ideas in advance, and it helps them organize their ideas for their composition as well. Next slide, please. Another thing that's very important in the previous program that was done on curriculum-based assessment, I touched on this, but it's very important that we give students feedback not only on their compositions, but their progress as writers. And there's several different kinds of feedback that I think are particularly important. If adults or students give feedback to a child or a youngster, what we typically see is about a 29 percentile point jump in overall quality. This works for both kids with and without writing difficulties. And so in this case, with peer feedback, it's very similar to what we were talking about peers before. We teach them a process for doing that. For example, it may be very simple, such as you look through somebody's paper, any place that's unclear, you put a question mark by. Any place where more information might be useful, you put a caret by, and then you work with them on how to give that feedback. Always start by saying a couple of things that you liked about the paper, and then treat that as a conversation where I say, on the places where there are question marks, can you tell me more here? Or I didn't understand this part. So there's more like a conversation. In terms of self-assessment, basically what we're doing is we're teaching kids, and teaching is the important thing here, how to assess their own papers using a particular assessment procedure. So for example, if you think about that story grammar strategy that I mentioned before, who's the main characters, when and where does the story take place, etc. One of the things that we've done with kids with special needs and kids without is we've taught them to assess their stories to make sure all of those basic elements are in there. So the who, when, and where are basically the setting. And then what the main character wants to do, what happens, you know, that involves an episode or more than one episode. But you can teach kids to assess whether they have those basic parts, or in persuasive writing, you can teach them to assess whether they have a clear reason, a clear premise or belief, whether they have specific reasons that support that, whether they elaborate on each of those reasons. So we can teach kids to do that, and when we do, it increases the likelihood that those elements, which are critical to clear writing, appear in their compositions. Next slide, please. Another thing that's, this one is not going to come as any surprise to anybody, but another way of supporting both kids who find writing challenging and those who don't is to use digital tools. And so I'm picking on the one here that's the most common. When we have kids both with special needs and without, when we have them use word processing over a 3-month to a year period, what we find when we compare those to kids who are simply writing by hand, we find an 18 percentile point jump in the quality of their compositions, even when we take the word processor away. And so why would something like word processing be helpful? Well, one, it's easy to move stuff, so you get in the habit of making revisions as you write, and it's easier to make them later. And once we get into the process of doing this, then it's more likely we'll do it when we write by hand as well. Now, I do want to give one warning here on word processing, and this applies to something I'll say in a little bit anyway in terms of writing by hand. So kids need to be able to type at about 20 to 25 words a minute to be able to take full advantage of digital tools like word processing. If they type slower than that, and their handwriting's faster, then they'll probably do better with handwriting. So one of the things that's very important is we make sure that they know how to use the digital tools that we use with them, and that they're fluent in terms of producing text, or at least reasonably fluent. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to switch gears here. So, we talked about it's important for kids to write. It's important that we support them as they write, and we gave some examples of that. But it's also extremely important that we teach them the skills, knowledge, and strategies that they need to be effective writers. Now, one of the areas that we know the most about in teaching both kids with and without disabilities is that if we teach kids strategies for planning, and I gave an example of one a little while ago in terms of the WWW, who, when, where, what happens, etc. If we teach strategies for either planning, revising, or editing, we see a positive jump in the overall quality of students' writing. This can involve generalized strategies like brainstorming or semantic webbing, or it can involve genre-based strategies like the one example I just gave for story writing. Let me give another example of this. For very young kids, 2nd and 3rd grade, we often teach a strategy called TREE, which is before you start writing, you develop your topic, idea, or sentence for what you believe. Then you brainstorm, that's the T part, topic, sentence. And then the R is you generate possible reasons, and you decide on at least 3 or more that you're going to make the case for in your text. If it's at the 3rd grade level when we use TREE, then each of those reasons you generate some possible explanation, evidence, or examples. And then the last part, the final E, would be you think about how you're going to end this so that you summarize the most important points in your persuasive or opinion essay. Next slide, please. In terms of teaching, some action steps is that we want to make sure that we teach strategies for both planning, revising, and editing, as I said before, not just a single process. The best teaching in terms of strategy is a gradual release model where we present the strategy to students, we talk with them about it, we model how to do it with them helping us, and then they do it together, and they do it independently with our help until they can do it by themselves. So the goal in terms of gradual release model is independent use by the students. Once students start to learn to use different strategies, we also need to help them think about which ones to use and where and how they might need to modify those, because we want them to be flexible in when they use particular strategies, and that they can think through how to use what they know in a flexible and adaptive manner so that they can meet the challenges of new writing assignments. Next step, please, or next slide, please. These are just some examples of a couple of strategies, very simple ones. I've already mentioned TREE, but this is the second grade version here. And then there's another one that's very simple for kindergarten to third grade on using your sentences. Next slide, please. And then this is one that we use with 4th to about 7th grade. It's called STOP. And basically it's a strategy for persuasive writing. And what we ask kids to do is, before they start writing on a particular controversial topic, we ask them to suspend judgment, and we ask them, either as a class, a small group, or an individual, generate as many ideas on each side of the argument as they can. Then they take a side. Usually, I don't think they really suspend judgment on the first part, so they usually take the side that they already were leaning towards. And then with all of that information that they've generated, we ask them to organize their ideas by going through, and let's say they take the side of, they take a particular side, then they star the points or reasons that will best support their idea on one side, and then they choose some ideas on the other side that they plan to refute. And then the last part of this plan more as you write is that they have this kind of general plan to start with. Now what we want them to do is keep planning as they go, and you'll see the DARE part at the bottom of this slide. So as they finish their composition, we have them self-check to see if they developed their topic sentence or what they believe. They've added supporting ideas, which are their reasons. They've rejected arguments on the other side, and they end with a conclusion. Next slide, please. Also, it's very important for all kids that we teach handwriting, spelling, and I would add keyboarding there as well. So you'll see that it says a 21 percentile point jump. That's not a 21 percentile point jump for handwriting and spelling. When we teach these skills, there's a 21 percentile point jump in the quality of writing if children are in 1st to 3rd grade. And this applies with kids with and without transcription difficulties in terms of acquiring these skills. So basically, a way of thinking about this, until handwriting, spelling, and keyboarding become more fluent and automatic, they interfere with other writing processes. As an example, all of us have experienced a situation where we're writing and ideas are coming really quickly and we can't get them down fast enough. Basically, our mind is faster than our hand, and we lose some of those ideas. And so think about a 1st grade kid who finds handwriting difficult. Often their handwriting speed is 10 letters per minute. That's a real challenge for getting your ideas down. And so once we reasonably master these skills, it frees up cognitive resources for other writing activities, and it doesn't interfere. And I'll add one other reason why it's important to do this. What we found in terms of summarizing writing studies over time is that kids who have poor handwriting, make spelling mistakes or grammar errors in their writing, people form judgments about the quality of what they say. And those have pretty stark effects on ratings that teachers give to the quality of students' writing. Next slide, please. Also, we want to be sure to teach sentence construction. Now, this is a really funny one. It's not really part of Common Core, and I don't quite understand it, because if you watch most people write, I would say about 90% of their cognitive effort is at the sentence level. They have an idea, they're trying to think about the right vessel or, syntactic structure to present it in or sentence to present it in, and picking the right words. So there's a lot of our cognitive effort goes on at this. So we're never going to become automatic at doing this because it's a thinking skill, but we want to become more fluent at doing it. So when we teach kids to combine smaller sentences into more complex ones, for example, the dog is big, the dog is brown, I model how to combine that into the dog is big and brown, or the brown dog is big. Then what happens is, as we do that kind of work, students, the quality of what they write increases because this is less of an interfering effect in writing. And guess what? I didn't write this here, but there's also an improvement in reading fluency. And I should have said this on the text transcription skills, handwriting and spelling. When we teach spelling, there's also evidence that word reading gets better, reading fluency gets better, and reading comprehension gets better. Next slide, please. Okay, so, this is the bad boy of writing instruction, grammar. When we've done meta-analysis taking a look at traditional grammar instruction, which typically involves defining what an adjective is, for example, and then practicing putting adjectives into blank spots in a sentence or picking an adjective out of 3 suggestions, we don't find that that has any effect either on improving grammar or improving overall quality of text. What we do know is that if we help students develop their own definitions by providing examples and non-examples, for example, with an adjective, I might bring up a person and we might generate some describing words for that person. I might bring up a place that we do that, and a thing and we do that, and then I help students come up with a definition for adjectives based on those, and then have them generate some examples and non-examples. That's our first step of being more effective in terms of grammar. Then I have to demonstrate how to apply that skill. So I might have a kernel sentence like the dog is big, the dog bit the mailman, and then we might think of some adjectives or describing words for the dog and for the mailman, and we might revise our sentence together and then have students practice those same skills together and then use them in context. Now, I say this is what I think would be a good model for doing it, but we really don't have evidence that that works. But we do know that the traditional way of giving a definition and decontextualized practice does not. Next slide, please. Another thing that's very important in terms of teaching is to teach writing knowledge. And basically what this means is we want to make sure that students are familiar with the basic structures of different types of text. And our starting point for doing this kind of teaching, and this works for kids with and without special needs, our starting point for this is what kids read. We want them to find, for example, the who, when, where in stories, what the characters' goals are, what the actions are. By doing that, we help them more solidify their knowledge of basic structures of stories. The same thing works for persuasive essays or informative essays. And when we do that, we get about a 20 percentile point jump in writing quality. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our fourth point, or the fourth point that I wanted to make. So write, support, teach, and connect. So here's the really good news, I think, for writing and for learning in general. When we use writing to support students' understanding of what is read, we get an 18 percentile jump in students' comprehension and remembrance of text material. So we're moving away on this one from quality to what happens in reading comprehension. Next slide, please. So this would be one example when we have kids take notes or use concept maps and we teach them to do that. One of the things that happens, note-taking or concept maps force kids, when they look at the material that they've read, to make decisions about what's important, possibly how to organize that information. They have to rework it in their own words or handle it. and that increases comprehension and learning of that text material. Next slide, please. This would be another example when we have to summarize. Obviously, we have to make decisions about what's the most important information, what's not important or not as important, how we can bring that information together to present it in a more concise form, which means we have to combine ideas as well as delete them. So it's not surprising that when we summarize material read, we get a jump in terms of comprehension performance. Next slide, please. Okay. The fifth point that I want to make, and this will leave us with a little bit of time for questions, which I wanted to be sure we had about 20 minutes to do, is that we talked about writing. We talked about supporting writers as they write. We've talked about what we need to teach. And we've talked about making a connection between writing and reading and writing and or learning in the content classroom. However, I think it's particularly important that we create a pleasant writing environment in which students can take risk and their work as a writer is appreciated and writing is valued. Now, I have to be really frank on this. All of the other things that I talked about, you saw, percentile jump. So where does the data for this recommendation come from? So one of the things that we did was we looked at studies on really effective literacy teachers, teachers whose kids made about 2 years gain for every year in terms of writing and reading. And one of the things that we noticed was that they were very consistent in applying the first 4 principles that I talked about, but they also did a lot of work at creating an environment in which kids could succeed and be successful. So let's take a look at what some of those things were. Next slide, please. So one of the things that these really phenomenal teachers did was that they acted as writers within their classrooms. So they wrote. It wasn't always that they wrote in the classroom, but they wrote and they shared their writing with their kids. And they asked for feedback on it. And so they became an active member within the community, and one who also had to take risk and one who was willing to take feedback from kids. Another thing that's a little more tricky is that we want to give students choices some of the time. Now, the reason I say not all of the time is it's not as clear what the effects in writing of choice are. But what choice does is it can lead to greater motivation to write. And so let me give a really simple example of this. Sometimes we give an assignment and a student will say, they'll ask us to tweak it a little bit. And if we say yes to that, if it's a reasonable tweak, and it means that they're still doing, within the ballpark of what we want, they're likely to be more motivated and more effortful in terms of doing that assignment. One of my favorite examples of this is Robert Benchley, who was one of Dorothy Parker's friends, who, when they were at Oxford University, was given an assignment to write about the British and American Trade Fisheries Act, which sounds boring. And so what he did was he wrote about it from the point of view of the fish. So he found a way of making it more interesting to him and more motivating. I think it's also really important that we look as often as possible to praise students' efforts and accomplishments. I actually would say that praise is more powerful in some ways than constructive feedback, or at least is equally effective in terms of doing this. So when we get feedback, I would recommend that we always start with something that we like. And, sometimes it's effort that we're praising, and sometimes it's accomplishments in the student's composition. As often as possible, we'd like for kids to write for real purposes with a real audience. We also want to publish students' writing, and that means the little kids that's up on the board, in the hallways, but with older students, that can be in anthologies or competing in competitions. And we want to extend the community beyond the classroom as to who our audience is, and sometimes writing back and forth. And then finally, We want to set realistic but challenging goals for our students. You know, basically what these really phenomenal teachers did was they were always pushing the envelope out a little. Now notice I say a little, not so much that students weren't going to be able to do the work, but they didn't settle. They basically made it clear to their kids they expected that they would all be great writers, and their job was to keep pushing them in that direction in a reasonable manner. Next slide. That may be the last one, but let's see. So this is an example of 2 ways of celebrating students' writing. I'm sorry, I forgot there was another slide. One day is the start. One example is the star of the day. Each student celebrated on their special day. They're seated in the front of the class. They answer interview questions. And then each student in the class composes 1 sentence about the star, and that's displayed and combined on a bulletin board. Or the author's chair, which I'm sure most of you are already familiar with. We have a special chair. Students read his or her work, or it could be their plans for their work. And the teacher models positive feedback such as, I really like, I could really picture, etc. So I would like to open it up for questions. And I think the way this will work is that Amy will come back and she'll relay questions to me.
Yep, you are correct. So a couple of the questions, and feel free, audience, to keep adding your questions in. I'll try and keep up as much as I can. But a couple of the questions that have come in so far. One of the ones was just kind of a specificity question. When you were talking about the clear goal setting and the specific instructions for kind of written assignments earlier on, there was a kind of a question about whether you had a specific name for that approach, and we just missed it. Something similar to thesaurus or something along that lines. Was there a specific name for that approach?
Yeah, so no, that's my own made-up name. So in terms of taking a look at revising that students do, this isn't actually really good news that I'm going to say here, but up until about the point of high school, when left to their own design, so to speak, when we ask kids to revise to make their papers better, just a general thing like that, we don't really see much in the way of improvement in overall quality of compositions until students start hitting 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade. However, as young as primary grades, when we teach students a strategy that focuses their attention not just on the mechanics of writing, but also on the substance, then we see also improvements of quality. And so when I was talking about a thesaurus approach to writing, revising, that's basically where, you're going in and you're not really doing much to the composition in terms of substance. You're fiddling around with words, spelling, punctuation, capitalization. And, quite honestly, when we interview kids, or kids with special needs and those without, anywhere from 1/3 or 2/3 of the things that kids say about what revising is involves that kind of thesaurus approach. So some kids define revising as doing just that, cleaning up errors, changing a word here or there.
Great, thank you so much. So the second question was based on someone's experience in instruction and writing. So they noted that one of the things that they've noticed is when they've provided detailed rubrics or excellent peer examples, what the expected outcome might be from a prior class or other students, they've seen some, and obviously with some caveats that it's not just copying or regurgitating the exact assignment that the other student did, but saw that there was some success in the expository writing for those students and improvement there. And they were just wondering whether or not there was any kind of research backing or any research related to kind of that model approach of providing models or rubrics. Yes, and so I didn't include every possible evidence-based practice in this. I wanted to give examples, but one of the things that,
it's really the two oldest tools in, kind of our tool belt as English teachers, per se, date back thousands of years. One is giving feedback, and the other one is using model essays. And so in research, I think the model essays have underestimated what students can do. So what typically has happened in research is we'll give students what we might think of as a model informative text or a model persuasive text, and then we'll give them an assignment, and we'll say, you want to try to emulate this kind of text. And so we leave it to kids in the research studies to go in and kind of figure out what the author is doing. I actually think that a more effective way of doing this, now that's been effective, so it gets about a 10 percentile point jump, but I think a more effective way is that we read that composition, that's the model text, together with kids, and we talk about what makes it a good composition, with the idea that we kind of pinpoint in terms of goals things that students will try in their own compositions. And I would say that's a good strategy more generally, that when we read with kids, we think about reading as we read with an author's eye. So we're trying to look to see what authors did that really made this part of the text interesting to us, and then we try it out in our own writing. That's basically what that model text idea is about, but I think we can make it better. The other part of this question is about the use of particular scales, etc., to evaluate students' writing. I didn't mention this, but in the teacher feedback section, a lot of that work there involved the use of scales or rubrics to evaluate writing, and that had a positive effect on students' writing.
Great, thank you. So then we had a question about, at what point do you switch from teaching handwriting, spelling, to teaching students how to use technology such as dictation software or spell check, particularly for students that might have fine motor challenges or phonological challenges and are now starting to get into those middle grades of 5th and 6th grade. Is there any kind of recommendation there?
Yeah, this is actually one that I have more experience with than I like. My daughter found both handwriting and spelling to be a real challenge. She couldn't spell a word like H-E-R-E correctly in 4th grade, and watching her write by hand was agony. I mean, literally, it was like she drew every letter in the most awkward way possible. So we actually made the transition to word processing in about 2nd grade. Now, the one challenge with that is that keyboards that most schools have or that you buy are for adult hands. And so we had to look for keyboards that were for kids' hands. The other thing that we're going to see more and more of, and we see it now with older kids, say with learning disabilities, is the use of text, speech-to-text synthesis. It's a little harder to do with younger kids because they have high squeaky voices, and so that kind of 90 or 95% error-free rate that Dragon Naturally Speaking or IBM Gold talk about, you don't see that with young kids, or at least my experience, you don't typically see that with young kids. But for kids who want to kind of get it right as they move into middle school and high school and have trouble with motor skills or have slow handwriting or other things, speech-to-text can be a very useful tool with one caveat. You really don't want writing to become extemporaneous thought. So the best way to kind of approach speech-to-text is to plan in advance what you're going to say. So in the 1960s, there were some studies of expert dictators, people who used to use dictaphones at work. 60% of their composing time was actually planning before they actually dictated into the dictaphone.
Cool. You learn something new every day. I had no idea about that, so that's really interesting. So we had a question about kind of recommendations around the idea, how do you help teachers that feel direct instruction or grammar instruction and grammar is really essential to English language arts instruction and curriculum, especially at the secondary level in high school? Any kind of strategies for talking with other folks about some of the items that you talked about and the research that you shared?
Well, no, the reason I'm laughing about this is people have very strong feelings about this. I teach a writing research seminar now that involves people from across different disciplines. So more than half the students are doctoral students in English, and they're not fans for the most part of not all of the students I get in the class, but many of them are not fans of, say, explicit or more direct instruction. And so I think one of the things that's very important and I'll say this in two ways, is that I do think it's important. I've seen plenty of instances, both in the research literature and also in just in the personal work we do with kids, where it makes a difference, particularly for some kids who find writing challenging. But in many instances, for all kids, a lot of writing takes place in your head, and you can't see what good writers do. And that's why things like modeling and practice and strategies, etc., can be very helpful for all kids. But I think the proof in the pudding, in terms of our colleagues who might not have the same viewpoint that I do, is that you demonstrate, you share examples of what happens when you do this. I also think, I said two things about this. That's one, with our colleagues we share. And second, students need to see their progress. One of the things that, especially for kids who struggle with writing, early on, when we ask them if, how good they are at writing, they overestimate their capabilities. They're too confident. But over time, you start hearing things like, I'm not very good, I hate writing, I can't do this. And so nothing works as well as success and being able to see that success in concrete terms. So remember before I was talking about we have kids assess their own writing? Well, we have them graph their progress, their own progress, so that they can see how well they're doing over time. And when we conference with them, we talk about two things, effort and the use of the things that they've been taught, and the role of improving their writing over time. And I'll tell you, I think it leads to more effective writers and writers who like to engage in the process more often. So I know that I took that opportunity to talk a little bit more than what the question was.
Oh, I think that all that information was really great and gets at some of the points that other people have made too. So then there were some questions about resources for when you were talking about sentence combining and creating complex sentences. Any specific resources you can share or recommendations around kind of resources around sentence combining or creating complex sentences? And then there was also a question about noting that in Hattie's work and Hattie and colleagues, that the effect size for sentence combining was really the size around 0.15. Any thoughts around kind of those findings or anything to share around that?
Okay, so let me deal with the resource. I'm crazy right now about a startup that's out of New York City called Quill. And so they have stuff online that they give away to teachers for free, both in terms of grammar instruction, which I'm less familiar with what they do on their grammar instruction, but they also have what I think is kind of the quintessential sentence combining tools that exist today. So what they've basically done is they've thought through, different kinds of complex sentences that kids need to learn to produce. So that they range from simple to compound to complex, and there's a variety of these. Then what they've done is they've taken those compound, complex, or simple sentences and broke them up into component parts. They're full sentences, they're kernel sentences, smaller sentences, and then basically they crowdsource them out to see how people put them together in various ways. And there's a couple of reasons for doing this. Then with all of those, let's say, let's go with the dog is big, the dog is black, something simple. They end up with a list of the various ways that people typically combine these. Of course, they may combine them in ways that didn't show up in the crowdsourcing. And then they go through and they make human judgments about, say, what they think are the best three ways of combining these sentences. And so their program is set up that they give students practice working on bringing those two adjectives together, big and brown, and when a student produces a response, they give hints that basically direct you towards one of their three solutions. Now, think about what that means if you're a teacher, because the hardest thing in sentence combining, you have to decide what it is that you're going to work on, what skill. Then you have to have examples to work from, so you have to, kind of round those up. And then it's really hard to give that kind of immediate feedback to kids right on the spot. So I'm in love with Quill and their sentence combining programs. And I would just want to be clear, I have no connection with them other than I've given them some advice on their program over time, but I have no financial connection. So I'm always a little leery about mentioning a program, but I am crazy about Quill. It also, they have connections with schools for a small amount, but I love that they give stuff to teachers away for free. So that would be my primary recommendation. In terms of what I think the second part of this question was, the effect size for sentence combining was a half a standard deviation or 0.50. That's a very, that's an effect size you'd like. I call that dancing on top of the Empire State Building. So when we teach kids to combine sentences together, the quality of their writing improves, and as I said before, their reading fluency improves, and probably reading and fluency improves because they become more, they recognize different syntactic structures that exist in sentences more quickly, and that facilitates comprehension. But I think the primary thing is that kids in terms of sentence combining become more facile in terms of their use of different kinds of sentences. Now, I will be frank about this. Sentence combining doesn't deal with one issue, one very important issue in terms of constructing sentences. When we construct a sentence, we are constructing that sentence for a particular purpose. So the practice that I was talking about is with somebody else's sentences, and that's why it's always very useful to go back to something you create or text you've already created to apply that skill within context so that we're putting it in place in terms of our own goals. So that was a very long response, but I hope I got both questions.
Yes, and for everyone that was interested in the Quill that Steve was mentioning, I just posted the link, and thank you to folks for tracking that down. Some folks are chatting into the question pod about that. So the link up there to that website that he was talking about, so you can explore it a little bit further. We do have a couple other questions about, go ahead.
Let me make one other comment. So, on the strategy instruction part, because I think that's very important, I want to give a shout out to Think SRSD. They have an online course for the self-regulated strategy development approach to strategy instruction. I didn't say this in my presentation, but that tends to get the largest oomph in terms of improving writing quality. Now, I do have to be very clear. My wife is a developer of SRSD, Karen Harris, who's a colleague of mine. So, even though I don't have a connection to SRSD online, I do have a connection to my wife. But I think their coursework is great. And if you email me at steve.graham@asu.edu, I'll probably pass the email along to you, and she can send you some other resources that are free online. So I'm sorry, but I wanted to get that plug in on that as well.
Great. So another question about resources was around any resources or suggestions around teaching peer feedback or self-assessment when you were talking about that. Any kind of tricks to point people to?
Well, so, there aren't programs per se that I know of for doing that. And so, I can tell you what the structure is that we use, and it's been successful in a number of research studies on peer feedback. What we'll do is we'll have a framework where we'll have 4 things that students give each other feedback on, anywhere from 2 to 4 things. So like the question mark I mentioned, any place that's unclear, any place that could use additional detail. And what we do is we practice with students, looking for those things in compositions that have already been written. We then practice how you give feedback. So we have the structure. We practice about how to find those kind of issues in students' paper. We practice giving the feedback to other students, and then we put it in play by pairing kids up and switching the pairs around relatively consistently. Now, there are some online programs that you could look at, and I'm not going to remember the links to this, that are digital, where you can have a setup where a student puts something in play, and what happens is you might have 3 or 4 people who give feedback on that. So a place to look on this, so there is some place that I'm going to mention, is CAST, C-A-S-T, which is in Massachusetts. It's a universal design group, and they've developed a number of writing products that I think are worth taking a look at. Writer's Key is one of those.
And it's just about a little after 4, so I want to be cognizant of the time. If people have any last questions, please type those in. And I do have a question from one folks that there's a little detailed, and so I'm going to send it to you after the webinar, Steve. I've got her email address. I just want to make sure I capture it correctly, and I couldn't get it over the speaker. But thank you first of all, I want to say thank you so much to Steve Graham for taking the time today to present to us and share these resources and information. I'm also just posting the link here in the chat for everyone to the Think SRDS site that Steve was mentioning as well. And then Nick, if you want to just flip over to the next slide. I wanted to point you guys to the NCII website if you're not familiar with it. This is where we're going to post the webinar after the event, and we'll have it archived there. You can come back to it at any point to listen or share with colleagues if they weren't able to attend. That will be under that resources tab that you see across the green bar at the top. There's a section for webinars, and I've shared the link to that. We try and get it up as soon as possible. It might take us a day or so to clean it up and just get it posted, but we should have it up there shortly. We will also post it on our YouTube channel. You can see that down there too. It's National Center on Intensive Intervention. Follow us on Twitter if you have Twitter, and join our newsletter. We would hope to stay connected with you all. This has been a great event, and a lot of great questions and a lot of great participation. So I also wanted to share some contact information for CEC's Division of Research. They also have a great website where they keep up-to-date information and announcements. They're on Twitter and Facebook, and you can connect with them there to learn more as well. So definitely dig in a little bit deeper with CEC. And for those that weren't able to attend the first webinar that I referenced earlier, that again is posted on the NCII website, so you can go back and listen to that one about data-based instructional decisions in writing and assessment in writing if you're interested in that topic and didn't get a chance. But again, thank you so much for taking the time on a busy Thursday afternoon, and thank you again, Steve, for your great presentation and all the great content and information about writing instruction.
Thanks for inviting me to share.